Welcome back, everybody, to ABA Chapter Chat. Today we're going to be looking at social behavior. We often talk about specific techniques on this show, but, social behavior, it really is the heart of so much of what we do in ABA.
Yeah, for sure. And what's really fascinating is how we can use these ABA principles to understand even these really complex social dynamics.
Okay, so before we get too far into it, let's start with a definition. How would you actually define social behavior?
Well, the material we're looking at today defines it as the behavior of two or more people with respect to one another or in concert with respect to a common environment.
Okay.
Yeah, so in simpler terms, it's really just how people act when they're around each other, whether they're cooperating, competing, or just, coexisting in a space.
Right. I mean, that makes sense, but I have to admit it sometimes feels like a huge leap going from studying like individual behavior to understanding how whole groups work. It's like a group has its own energy, right? It's more than just like adding up all the parts.
Yeah, you're right. Groups can definitely feel like they have a life of their own. But the thing is, those group dynamics actually come from the individual behaviors of the people in them. Think about like a classroom. If each kid is individually motivated to get the teacher's attention, you might see a lot of calling out or disruptive behavior as they compete for that reinforcement.
Oh, yeah.
And suddenly you have a noisy classroom problem, but it's not some magical group thing. It's the result of each kid acting on their own motivations.
So if we can understand what's motivating each person, then we can see how that affects the whole group.
Exactly. And that's really where understanding reinforcement becomes crucial, especially when we're talking about social situations.
Okay? Because we're not just talking about like giving someone a sticker or M&Ms, right? We're talking about things like praise, attention, acceptance, all those things humans want from each other. And it seems like everyone reacts to those social reinforcers so differently.
Yeah, you're right. One of the key things that makes social reinforcement different is that it's mediated by another person. How you react to praise depends on your relationship with the person giving it their tone of voice, your past experiences with praise, all sorts of things go into it.
Oh, totally. Like a compliment from someone you really admire could make your whole day, but if someone you didn't respect said the same thing, it wouldn't mean anything to you.
Right, exactly. And that's a really big takeaway for ABA professionals. When we're designing interventions, we can't just assume that a certain social interaction is going to be reinforcing for every client. We have to do our homework and figure out what is actually rewarding for that individual.
So it's about tailoring those reinforcers, right? Understanding what makes each person tick on a social level.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing about social reinforcement is that it's often intermittent. It's not like a vending machine where you put in your money and you get a snack every time. People are way less predictable.
So does that make social reinforcement weaker? Because it's not happening every single time?
Not at all. In fact, intermittent reinforcement can make behavior incredibly persistent. Think about a kid throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. Most of the time, the parent might be firm and ignore it, but every once in a while, maybe when they're stressed or in a hurry, they give in and buy the candy bar.
Oh, yeah?
And for the kid that's like hitting the jackpot, even though they aren't getting reinforced every time, those occasional wins keep that tantrum behavior strong.
It's like those slot machines in Vegas. You don't win on every pull, but the chance that you might win big keeps you putting in those coins.
Exactly. And we see that all the time with social interactions, right? Like we keep texting that friend who only replies sometimes, or we keep trying to impress that person who rarely notices us. It's the power of intermittent reinforcement.
So that explains why some behaviors, even unwanted ones, are so hard to change. That reinforcement history is like superglue.
Precisely. And to make things even more complex, the requirements for social reinforcement often change over time. Think about how we teach kids new skills. We start with really simple expectation and reinforce any attempt. And as the child learns, we slowly increase the demands and become picky with our praise.
That's like how parents teach their kids to ride a bike. You might praise them just for sitting on the bike at first, then for pushing off with their feet, and eventually for pedaling all by themselves. You build on each step and change the reinforcement as they go.
That's a perfect example. And the takeaway here is that changing behavior in social situations often happens gradually and not in big leaps. So as ABA professionals, we need to be patient and realize that building those new social skills takes time and consistency.
It's like climbing a mountain. You don't reach the top in one giant step. You take it one step at a time, adjusting your plan along the way.
Now imagine you're trying to climb that mountain, but the wind keeps changing directions, making the ground unpredictable. That's kind of what it's like working as social reinforcement. It's always shifting.
Okay, so what challenges does that create for ABA professionals working with clients?
Well, because social systems are always in flux, it can be hard to predict how a client will respond to an intervention. What works one day might not work the next because the social environment has changed. Maybe a new student joined the class and disrupted the social hierarchy, or maybe your client had a fight with their best friend and now peer approval isn't as motivating anymore.
So we can't just set a plan in motion and expect it to run perfectly. We need to be watching and adjusting our approach as the social dynamics change.
Absolutely. And to add another layer of complexity, social behavior is heavily influenced by what we call social stimuli. Things like facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, these cues tell us about the social environments and how we should act in it.
Okay, but that's where things can get a bit tricky, right? A smile doesn't always mean the same thing. How do we teach clients to understand these sometimes very subtle social cues?
You're right, social cues can be super nuanced. The key is to remember that their power comes from the reinforcement history associated with them.
Like I'm following. It's not just the cue itself, but what that cue represents for that person based on their past experiences.
Yes, exactly. For example, let's say a child has always gotten positive attention from adults when they raise their hand in class. Over time, that act of raising their hand becomes a powerful signal for them. Even if the teacher isn't looking at them, they've learned that raising their hand will probably get them the attention they want.
It's like a shortcut for them to get what they want, a way to navigate the social world based on patterns they've learned.
That's a great way to put it. But here's where things get even more interesting. The meaning of those social cues can be totally different depending on cultural background and individual experiences.
Oh, this is a fun one. It's like the classic example of giving a thumbs up. In some cultures, it's a positive sign, but in others, it can be a really big insult. Imagine the miscommunication if you got that wrong.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important for us as ABA professionals to not make assumptions about what a certain social cue means to our clients. We need to understand their individual stories, their cultural backgrounds, and the unique experiences that have shaped how they see the social world.
So it's not just about knowing ABA principles. It's about understanding each individual person and their unique social world.
You got it. We need to be like anthropologists, constantly observing, learning, and changing our approach based on all the experiences that shape our clients' behavior.
Wow, this is giving me a whole new appreciation for how complex social behavior really is. It's like peeling back the layers of a onion, and every layer reveals new insights and challenges.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of peeling back layers, there's this really interesting concept in the materials you sent called the social episode. It's a way to understand how interactions between people actually work.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, instead of seeing a social interaction as one big thing, we can break it down into smaller chunks, each with its own behaviors, consequences, and motivating factors.
So it's like watching a movie and analyzing each scene, understanding how every scene contributes to the overall story.
Exactly. And one of the most interesting examples they use is the idea of stalking, both in the literal sense and also in that more metaphorical sense of like steering a conversation towards something someone else is trying to avoid.
Okay, that sounds intense. How does this stalking example help us understand social episodes?
Well, think about it this way. The stalker is doing that behavior because it's being reinforced somehow. Maybe they're getting attention or enjoying that feeling of control. And the person being stalked is also reacting in a way that's being reinforced. Maybe they're avoiding conflict or worried about hurting the other person's feelings.
So by analyzing what each person is getting out of the interaction, we can start to understand why it's happening that way. It's like we're detectives trying to figure out the motives of each character to understand the plot.
That's such a great way to put it. And the great thing about this framework is that we can apply it to all kinds of interactions, not just the dramatic ones. We can use it for simple requests, complex arguments, pretty much anything.
So it's like a tool to understand how any social interaction works underneath the surface.
Exactly. And it's especially helpful for ABA professionals because it helps us to see past the behavior itself and find those specific reasons why the interaction is happening that way.
This is already making my head spin a little, and it's already giving me a new way to think about how we approach social skills training in ABA. But before we go too deep into that, I wanted to touch on something we talked about earlier, how cultural differences and individual experiences can change how someone sees a social cue. It's easy to say we need to be aware of those differences, but how do we actually do that? Can you give us some real-world examples?
Of course. Let's talk about personal space for a second. In some cultures, it's totally normal to stand really close to someone while you're talking. It's a sign of closeness. But in other cultures, it might seem intrusive or disrespectful. So imagine you're working with a client who comes from a culture where close proximity is normal, and they're always standing too close to their classmates, making them uncomfortable.
That's a great example. We might think the client is being disruptive or aggressive on purpose if we don't understand their cultural background.
Right. We might even try to teach them to keep a bigger distance when really what they need is to learn the social norms of this new environment.
So it's not about forcing them to change their behavior to match our expectations, but helping them understand how to navigate the social world around them.
Exactly. It's recognizing that there are lots of different ways to be social and what's right can change a lot depending on the culture.
This makes me think about how important it is to involve families in the process. They're the experts on their own culture and can give us so much insight into the client's behavior.
Absolutely. Families can help us understand the meaning behind behaviors that we might totally misunderstand. And they can help us create interventions that are sensitive to the client's culture and relevant to their life.
And it's not talking about culture either, right? Individual experiences can change how someone reads social cues.
For sure. Let's say you're working with a client who was bullied a lot in the past. Something simple like someone bumping into them in the hall could make them really anxious because of what happened to them before.
So we need to be sensitive to those individual triggers and help them develop coping strategies.
Exactly. It's about understanding how each client sees the social world and adapting our approach to that.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects back to the idea of the social episode. We're not just reacting to the behaviors themselves, but digging deeper to understand the reasons, the triggers, the reinforcement history that led to those interactions.
You got it. And remember, social episodes aren't just about negative interactions. We can use this framework to look at any kind of social exchange, a casual conversation, a group project, even a romantic relationship.
So if we're working with someone who has trouble making friends, we could use the social episode framework to break down their interactions with peers, see where they're getting stuck, and then teach them specific skills to get past those roadblocks.
Perfect example. You might notice that a client starts conversations just fine, but then has trouble keeping them going. By analyzing the social episode, you might discover they're missing those cues that the other person is getting bored. Or maybe they aren't asking questions back.
And once we zero in on those specific areas, we can use all of our ABA tools like prompting reinforcement shaping to help them develop those missing skills.
Exactly. It's all about taking a systematic and personalized approach to social skills training, guided by those ABA principles.
This reminds me of that pigeon experiment you mentioned, where one pigeon became the leader and controlled the button pecking. It seems like understanding those roles of leading and following is crucial for analyzing social episodes, especially in human interactions.
You're absolutely right. We all take on different roles in different situations. Sometimes we lead, sometimes we follow, sometimes we share the lead. And being able to switch between those roles easily is a big part of successful social interactions.
But what if those roles become rigid or unhealthy? Like, what if someone always has to be the leader, or they always let others walk all over them?
That's a great point. Then we're talking about power imbalances, unhealthy relationships, and possibly even abuse or exploitation. As ABA professionals, we need to be able to spot those red flags and step in when needed.
So it's not just about teaching our clients how to behave in social situations, but about helping them build healthy, respectful relationships.
Beautifully said. It really emphasizes the importance of teaching assertiveness, boundary setting, and self-advocacy as part of social skills training.
Okay, so we've talked about cultural differences, individual experiences, social episodes, leading and following. It's clear that there's a lot that goes into analyzing social behavior, but there's one more piece I want to talk about: verbal behavior. It's such a basic part of our social world, but we often overlook it or oversimplify it.
I agree. We tend to think of communication in terms of ideas and meanings, but for behavior analysts, verbal behavior is like any other behavior. It's shaped by its consequences and follows the principles of reinforcement.
You mentioned an example from the materials where they break down a simple request like "give me a cigarette." It was amazing to see how even a short phrase like that is actually a whole chain of behaviors and stimuli, each has its own function and history.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for ABA professionals to understand verbal behavior. We need to be able to analyze those chains, see what's keep all those problematic communication patterns going, and then develop specific interventions to address them.
So it's not just about teaching clients to say the right words, but about understanding why they're communicating that way.
Exactly. And that's what makes ABA so unique. We aren't just treating symptoms, we're addressing the root causes of those symptoms.
This is all so fascinating. It's like we're learning a whole new language, the language of behavior. And it's giving us a whole new way to understand and help our clients. It feels like we've covered so much already, from how social reinforcement works to the complexities of verbal behavior.
It's been quite a journey, and we've still got one more really important area to explore, the power of the group. We've talked about how groups can really amplify reinforcement and shape behavior, but what does that mean for us as ABA professionals?
Right. It's one thing to understand this stuff in theory, But how do we actually use it in our everyday work?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that groups are like everywhere. Our clients are in families, classrooms, communities. All these groups have a huge influence on their behavior. So we can't just focus on the individual. We have to understand those systems they're a part of.
So it's like we need to be social ecologists, studying how individuals and their environments interact. But how do we even start? How do we figure out those group dynamics?
It's a little like being a detective. You have to observe, gather information, ask the right questions. What are the unwritten rules, the power dynamics, the patterns of interaction within that group? Who are the main players? What are they trying to get out of it? How does the group react to different behaviors?
Sounds like we have to be super tuned into those subtle cues, the things that aren't said out loud, the stuff that can really make or break a social interaction.
Exactly. And once you have a good grasp of how that group works, then you can start thinking about how to intervene. Sometimes the intervention might mean working with the whole group, changing how things work to encourage more positive interactions.
Can you give me an example of what that might look like?
Sure, imagine you're working with a child who's having a hard time being included in games at recess. You observe and realize the other kids don't want to play with them because they keep interrupting or changing the rules. So in that case, you might work with the whole group to set clear rules for taking turns and cooperating, reinforcing positive interactions, maybe even using a timer to help that child understand when it's their turn.
So it's about structuring the environment to make those positive interactions more likely and teaching everyone how to be a good member of the group.
Exactly, but sometimes you might focus on helping your client navigate those group dynamics better. Maybe they need to learn how to read social cues more accurately or how to stand up for themselves while still being respectful of others.
That makes me think about how important it is to teach things like assertiveness and boundary setting. It's not about always following the rules or going along with whatever's happening. It's about being able to speak up for yourself and set limits in those interactions.
Absolutely, and sometimes the best thing you can do is help the client find a different group one that's a better match for their interests and social style.
That's a great point. We don't have to try to fit a square peg into a round hole. Sometimes it's about finding the right social environment where the client can really thrive.
This has been a fantastic discussion about social behavior. We've covered so much ground, but I think the most important thing to remember is that even though social interactions can seem really messy, they still follow those same basic principles of behavior we see everywhere else.
And once we understand those principles, we can start to make sense of the social world and use that knowledge to help our clients navigate that world more effectively.
Perfectly said. It's been a pleasure diving into this topic with you.
Same here. And to all our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us. We hope this has given you some useful ideas that you can use in your own work as APA professionals. Until next time, keep exploring that fascinating world of behavior.